Okay, gents, time to take up Unit 8, which is the Second World War. You see 1935 to 45. Second World War ends in 1945, but to understand it, you have to go back a little bit before the war. The war, of course, begins traditionally in 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland. We'll see that's not quite right. And the U.S. enters in 1941 with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But we have to go back to 1935. Now, let me point something out. This is a Regents Review lecture. I am not going to be able to do the history of the Second World War. There are scholars who spend their lives studying this. I'm not going to be able to hit everything. And the Regents exam itself tends not to pay much attention to the war itself. That is to say, the strategy, the tactics, most of the stuff, we'll see the exception about things like weaponry and the famous generals and so on. It tends to ignore that. It's more interested in how we get to the war and what the results and changes in society are. So you can have a lot of interest in World War II. You can go research stuff on your own. That's great. I am going to only stick to the sort of bare essentials of the sorts of things the Regents exam likes to concentrate on. Okay, so we begin. As situations overseas deteriorated, President Roosevelt's leadership helped to move the nation from a policy of neutrality to a pro-Allied position, and ultimately to direct involvement in the war. So what are we talking about? I move down just a bit, and once more, I remind you, if you are not looking at it, you should be using the review notes, U.S. History Regents, shared OneNote document. If you don't have it, you have to get your hands on it, because that's what I'm using as the outline here. Okay. So let's start in Europe. As we know, Hitler came to power in 1933. You may remember that from Global. He becomes Chancellor of Germany. He's not making war yet. 1933, nobody's at war with anybody, and he is not yet engaging in mass executions. He's just a kind of pain-in-the-neck politician. By 1936, he is starting to make noise in Europe about wanting more Lebensraum, which is German for living space. Talking about taking back what had been traditional German lands in other countries, parts of Czechoslovakia, Poland, and France, rebuilding the German military, which had been reduced because of the Treaty of Versailles, and so on. He's making noise about this. The U.S. is looking at this and responds with the Neutrality Act of 1935. There's no war yet, but there is constant fear of war breaking out in Europe. People keep talking about that it's going to happen, it's inevitable, maybe no, it's not inevitable, maybe it will be, maybe it won't. The American people want nothing to do with it. Think back to George Washington, farewell address, avoid foreign entanglements, isolationism. That's the default setting, if you like, for the American people. That's what they want to go back to. So Congress passes a law. In case anybody ever goes to war over there, the U.S. cannot sell anybody any weapons, any supplies, provide any money to any countries that are at war in the future. This is to prevent the sort of thing that led the U.S. into World War I. If you remember, Woodrow Wilson, before World War I, had wanted to keep the country out of it, but had started using American ships to supply the Allies, had been selling material to them. There was some question about how much in the way of ammunition and arms was being sold, etc. So we want to stay out of it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We know FDR as Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Maybe I should add the note again. Is against this. He thinks the U.S. should prepare to help the Allies in case of war. FDR sees Hitler on the horizon and is afraid of where all this is going and thinks if he goes after France, if he goes after Britain, the U.S. has to be prepared to help. So he doesn't like this Neutrality Act, but he's forced to go along with it because public opinion is so strong. 2 years later, in 1937, they pass a new Neutrality Act. A civil war had broken out in Spain between fascists, kind of Spanish version of Nazis, didn't quite have the racial issue that the German Nazis have, friends with Mussolini in Italy. So you had the fascists in Spain on the one side and the so-called Republicans on the other side, who were kind of heavily influenced by socialism and left-wing causes. So the U.S. sees that happening in Spain. Again, we're not involved. Some individual Americans are. Some famous American authors went over there. Ernest Hemingway went over and helped out in the Spanish Civil War. But again, we're getting afraid. We don't want to get dragged into. Hitler's starting to sound more aggressive. So the Neutrality Act of 1937 forbids any U.S. ships from being used to move supplies to any country at war. So in 1935, we say you can't sell anything to the Allies, should they ever happen, because there's no war yet. 1937, we say, not only can't you sell them stuff, but you can't even use American ships to ship stuff that they buy elsewhere. Okay. But, oddly enough, it allowed what was known as cash and carry. A country at war under this act was allowed to buy things from the U.S. My typing is awful, huh? Non-weapons materials, like food. So Britain could buy food from the U.S. as long as they paid cash. No credit from the U.S. government, where we were effectively loaning the money. And they used their own ships, not U.S. ships. That way, if they were torpedoed, U.S. was not involved. Your problem. Once again, there's no war yet, except for the Civil War in Spain. But Britain is starting to build up its military a bit. France is starting to build up its military a bit, afraid of Hitler. 1939 ends even the cash and carry thing. By 1939, early 1939 this is, Hitler peacefully, quotes, takes Austria and part of Czechoslovakia. That's the Sudetenland. Remember that? You may remember from Global. So the Anschluss, he annexes Austria. He takes over the Sudetenland part of Czechoslovakia. There's not a shot fired. No war yet. But he hasn't invaded Poland yet. That comes later in the year. So the U.S., seeing things are not going well in Europe, says, we don't even want to do the cash and carry. Let's just get out of it. By 1940, Hitler has now started the war. He's invaded Poland. War is raging. And Britain is starting to get in real trouble, as is France. I guess I should put that in there. Oops. FDR wants to help. He sees them as our allies, our friends, and if Hitler takes France and Britain, who's next maybe? He wants to do something, but he can't under the previous law. So he cooks up this idea of lend-lease. We are not going to sell anything to anybody. We are going to rent it to them. That is, lease it. useful war goods, even ships. They're renting it, but they won't have to actually pay for it until later. So they're renting it, but we're lending them the rental money until they can pay it back later. It's effectively a way to give them stuff. That's really what it comes down to. And we start helping to supply the Allies using Lend-Lease. The second largest nation to get help, by the way, was the Soviets. Soviet Union was also, by this time, fighting with Hitler, or would be shortly. And really it's more toward 41, you get that. And was badly in need of supplies. So Britain is the number one, and the Soviets are number two. FDR does something else. He starts a draft, the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. We had done a draft twice before, once in the Civil War and once in World War I, once the war had started. FDR starts a draft in 1940. The war is going in Europe, but we have no part of it. Once again, FDR sees what is on the horizon and wants America prepared for it. So when you summarize this, what's going on? The U.S. starts off in a sort of state of terrified neutrality. But it grows more and more sympathetic to the Allies as Hitler becomes clearly more and more of a jerk. And the British, by the way, just as in World War I should point out, are very good at communicating to the American people what's going on, and they make their case. Winston Churchill, who becomes Prime Minister of Britain, is rather famous in America himself. He was half American. This is a side thing. His father was a British politician and aristocrat. His mother was actually an American who had gone over to England to marry him. And Churchill always made quite a thing of the fact that he was both American and British. So they use this to kind of convince Americans that our natural allies are the British. Eventually, the U.S. finds ways to stay neutral technically, but also to help the Allies. Well, that's all what's going on over in Europe. Let's take a look for a minute at what's going on over in the Pacific. Japan had invaded China in 1931, and I'll show you a map here, if I can get this. Let me pull this down. Bap. Okay. So there's Japan. And just to remind you, you're smart guys, so you remember this. Japan is these islands. These islands have nothing. They have pretty good fishing. There's a little bit of rice grown there, but not enough actually to feed the people. It doesn't really have much else. There's no, and I'm just going to pull this down here. There's no coal, there's no iron, and if Japan wants to industrialize, be a military power, it can't do it without that. So starting early on, Japan had been looking to acquire land. They take these islands in 1875. 1905, they get into a war with Russia over this piece of Sakhalin Island. 1910, they take the Korean Peninsula. They had also acquired out here some of these little, bits and pieces islands out here. Iwo Jima, the famous Iwo Jima, is just one of the volcanic islands. You have dozens of these. They're called Micronesia because there's so many little tiny islands out here. So they've been taking some of these islands. They had even taken the island of Formosa, we call it Taiwan today. 1931, they go in here to Manchukuo. That's what they call it. The Chinese call it Manchuria. The Japanese rename it in Japanese Manchukuo. This is a pretty heavy-duty coal and iron area. And then they begin to expand even farther. In the 30s, they are going to move into these coastal towns and even to Peking or Beijing, which is the capital of China. These are mostly the old names for these. So Beijing used to be called Peking. 1937, they expand their invasion, all down in here. They take Shanghai. They already in Port Arthur there. You have the event, you should remember from Global, I'm not going to go all through it, the rape of Nanking. They go into one of the principal cities of China, which doesn't happen to be shown here for some reason, and destroy it and do mass slaughter against the people. So I'll pull this up. You see here, oh, there's Nanjing there. Nanjing, or Nanking as it was called at the time, is right there. And you see it there. They took it, by the way, because it was a railroad hub. That's a minor issue. But you see that the Japanese have taken all of this. So this is what's going on as far back as the mid-1930s. The United States responds to all this Japanese aggression with cash and carry and lend-lease as above. So we help out some of our allies down there, but we don't actually get too involved. U.S. did not consider that we had vital interests in China at the time. I'll put that in quotes there. But once Japan really begins to expand, they now become a threat to the Philippine Islands that are down here. Yeah? And I don't know if it's, nope. Just below this, down here, you see a bit of it sticking up. You have Indonesia. The Philippines, of course, are thick with rubber. We talked about that when we talked about imperialism for the United States. That's why the United States is still occupying this in the 1930s. It's still a dependency of the U.S. Indonesia, which is down here and below this map, a series of islands, has big oil deposits in it, and we had started to exploit oil. So the United States, and actually the oil in Indonesia, a lot of it was owned by Standard Oil Company. Remember that from John D. Rockefeller? That's still around. Called then SO. Get it? SO? SO, that was the name of the company. We now call it still exists, Exxon. U.S. begins to embargo steel, ban sales to Japan, steel, coal, and oil. So to embargo something is to withhold it. You can't sell it to them. Worried about the Japanese using all that steel and coal and now oil, which was used for their ships as fuel, we start to make it illegal to sell it to them. Japan decides to cripple the U.S. fleet. There's a big buildup to this. It takes a while. I'll show you that in just a second. But the Japanese, realizing that they are inevitably going to confront the U.S. in the Pacific, whether anybody wants to or not, decide better to do it early than later. If they can destroy the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, they can make it so hard for us, it takes so long to rebuild, that they can, in the meantime, take all those islands, and by that time, then, it's done, and the U.S. can't really do anything about it. They wanted to take, as well, all of Southeast Asia. This is French Indochina down here, and they had already started to do that. By the time, well, this is not really, you can see it a little bit here. By the time they attack Pearl Harbor, they're already going after Bangkok in Thailand. They will eventually take Malaysia. They will take French Indochina, which today this is Vietnam along the coast, Laos in here, and Cambodia or Kampuchea in there. So they figure, well, if we nail the U.S.'s fleet, It'll take them years to rebuild. We can take everything we want down there, and then let's see the U.S. try to do something about it. And so there was a slow buildup of this, and I just show you, maybe. Okay, so this is the New York Times. U.S. embargoes scrap iron hitting Japan. In the meantime, British are fighting Berlin. Italy and Spain were signing a treaty, etc., right? So here you got U.S. embargoing Japan for iron. September of 1940. December 7th, 1941 is Pearl Harbor. So this is more than a year before. Here you got newspaper from December 6th, 1941. And it took overnight to report something in the newspaper. Something happened, the reporters wrote it up, printed it up, and you got it the next morning. So if this is December 6th, this is the news really from December 5th. And it says, radio reports Japanese fleet off Philippines. So they're talking about Japanese Navy movements over here. This is not the fleet that went after Pearl Harbor, by the way. It's way too far away from Pearl Harbor. They're just reporting about it, but they're talking about this Count Kaneko, who was one of the members of the Japanese government, proposes a peace commission. They're still telling America they want to talk about peace on December 5th. December 7th, this is the morning newspaper. So this was printed the night before. Yeah? So this is the news from December 6th. You woke up in the morning and this was the headline. Roosevelt sends note to Mikado. The Mikado was actually very incorrect, but common word used for the Japanese emperor. FDR and the emperor were sending frantically diplomatic notes to each other, trying to avoid war. How do we negotiate our way out of this? FDR wouldn't back down, that Japan had to stop its military actions against other countries. Japanese government kept talking, and in fact what they were doing was, we now know, distracting us. Kurusu here was the Japanese ambassador to the U.S. And this is, you see, Japanese may strike over the weekend. This is just before December 7th. Kurusu, and you see, foreign affairs expert attacks Tokyo madness. The Kurusu was the Japanese ambassador to the U.S. The morning of December 7th, 1941. It's a Sunday morning. You guys, I hope know the story. You've seen videos and documentaries on it. Go look it up. The Japanese attack the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. The same moment they are doing that, out in the Pacific, in Washington, D.C., on the east coast of the United States, the Japanese ambassador was sitting in the office of the Secretary of State, head of our foreign policy, delivering a message to him saying, the emperor says, it doesn't really seem like negotiations are working. I am not joking about this. Because even the Japanese ambassador in the United States did not know Pearl Harbor was coming. The Japanese government had hid it from him. He was trying to negotiate a peace. He was told by his government that his job was to negotiate a peace. What he didn't know was that he was really acting as a kind of cover for the military while they made the long trip across the Pacific in secret to bomb Pearl Harbor. That's all a true story. So while he's sitting in Cordell Hull's office, he was the Secretary of State, it's Cordell Hull, the U.S. Secretary of State, who blows a gasket at him and starts screaming at him over his desk. And Kurusu's completely confused because Hull tells him, you're giving me this note. I just got information. We just got a radio message that our fleet is being bombed in Pearl Harbor. That was how the Japanese ambassador found out about it. It's a true story. So once that happens, Americans were shocked, utterly. Even though you saw that in the newspapers, and people vaguely knew that there was something going on with Japan and something going on, the average guy didn't pay that much attention to oil embargoes of Asian countries. Like it didn't register with them. So when Pearl Harbor was bombed, it came as a complete shock. And people found out about it almost live. Pearl Harbor was bombed early in the morning of December 7th, Hawaii time, which was already early afternoon in the U.S. So people were sitting around. Remember radios? The radio was now, everybody had one in their home, and it was the source of entertainment, no TVs yet. Everybody sat around listening to the radio, and they broke in to the afternoon programs. There were like these concerts and stuff that were very popular, to announce a bulletin that Pearl Harbor was in the process of being bombed. It was considered a sneak attack. Before Pearl Harbor happens, the correct way, if you want, to fight a war, the legal way in international law, was to inform the other country that we don't see a point in negotiating anymore. We are now declaring war on you. Brace yourself because an attack is coming. That was how you did it. The idea that you attack first and then declare war was considered dastardly and sneaky. The U.S. goes overnight from aggressively stay out of the war to all in. The afternoon of December 7th, men made plans to join the Army. By the next morning, which was a Monday morning, recruiting stations were open late, and there were lines around the block. And in fact, the military started turning guys away and asking them not to sign up. This is absolutely true. You can go look it up. They had so many guys flood. They told guys, go home. We will draft you when we need you, rather than have everybody sign up all at once because they weren't ready to handle it. And people had demands for revenge on Japan. Once we go to war, again, they're not going to talk much about the strategy and tactics. Just a few things to be aware of. Roosevelt is, of course, the commander-in-chief. As President of the United States, he's head of the military. He works with Churchill. France has fallen by this time to the Nazis. So has Poland. So has the Netherlands and Belgium and so on. So the last sort of free countries fighting Germany, at least fully free countries, are Britain and the U.S. Britain is home to a lot of refugees. So there were French guys who got out of France, made it to Britain, and had sort of reformed units there. There were Polish Polish guys who got out of Poland to get to Britain so they could keep fighting. They reorganized the Polish military. But it was really Britain and the United States that were going to have to do this. Churchill makes a visit to Washington. He risks coming across the Atlantic, visits Roosevelt, and the two of them have a series of long discussions. And they agree. Churchill convinces Roosevelt it's obvious that there's a two-theater war. Two theaters, two regions. We call a region war a theater. Europe and the Pacific. So they decide they're going to fight in both, but they're going to first concentrate their efforts on Europe. Churchill, I guess for obvious reasons, talks Roosevelt into that in his own interest. And the U.S., and they decide again, they're going to fight in both. We certainly fought in the Pacific, but we're going to concentrate the efforts first on Europe and then sort of turn all our attention to the Pacific. FDR appoints commanders. They probably will not ever ask the names of these guys, but I just mentioned them. So General George C. Marshall, overall command of the U.S. Army. He stays in Washington throughout the war. He's in charge of organizing the whole thing. Dwight Eisenhower, known as Ike, is put in command of the U.S. forces in Europe. Douglas MacArthur is put in command of U.S. forces in the Pacific. Ike becomes commander there. So the British and French troops actually sort of come under him. In the Pacific, largely it's the U.S. that's fighting. So MacArthur is, in theory, the Allied commander there, but really he's commanding mostly American troops. That was a tricky thing for Eisenhower, because as we see down here, the Allies had gigantic egos. You have FDR himself, Churchill, and Stalin of the Soviet Union. All three of them, had big opinions of themselves and wanted to be the top dog. So FDR, to some degree, had to manage Churchill and Stalin. They hated each other. Well, FDR and Churchill got along a bit, but Churchill and Stalin hated each other. But they needed each other. You also had the military commanders. Churchill, who was in England, of course, with the troops, and, just because he's there for the government, thought of himself as kind of a military commander. You had British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who was one of many big ego British commanders. Charles de Gaulle, who was the main French guy and a huge ego. Eisenhower was an assertive guy himself. So Eisenhower had to sort of manage Montgomery and de Gaulle and his own guys. You guys know enough, you usually like U.S. history. Patton and Bradley and some of these other characters. He had to keep everybody in place. So it was really like herding cats. The Atlantic Charter is the name of the alliance between the United States and Britain. It's sort of a treaty that they set up, which becomes the basis for NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, during the Cold War later on. Okay, I'm not going to get into the warfare and the tactics of the war. Regents tends not to spend time on it. It is a great part of history, but this is a Regents review thing. So, Regents does like to ask about the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb, the plan to create an atomic bomb, is codenamed the Manhattan Project. That's because it was a project originally of the Manhattan office of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. So the Corps of Engineers are the technical branch of the U.S. Army. They had offices in several cities, and each of them had a kind of project. The Boston project had to do with radar. There was a Philadelphia project which had to do with a number of things, but really kind of trying to make ships safer against things like mines and torpedoes. The Manhattan Project was this, the building of the atomic bomb. It starts in a little office that they had in Manhattan, and eventually it's going to move. They needed massive facilities to work on, design, think through, and then build the bomb. And so the main part of it is down in Los Alamos, New Mexico. But really, there were bits and pieces everywhere. So Oak Ridge, Tennessee, for instance, there was a nuclear reactor there that they used to make some of the fuel for the bomb. there were college kids in various places working on the bomb without knowing it. I actually knew one. My physics teacher when I was in high school, not that you care about this, but just to give you an illustration, was a young physics student at Columbia University. He was working on his graduate degrees in physics at Columbia. And they had all of these really hyper smart kids at Columbia, at the University of Chicago, and some of these other places, working through highly complex physics mathematics, not really knowing what they were working on. They gave them sort of pieces of the puzzle without enough to be able to see the whole puzzle for security reasons. So a lot of this was done by these brilliant, very young physicists, because a lot of this was a very new field. Anyway, the Manhattan Project started because Albert Einstein, no kidding, wrote a letter to FDR. There was a physicist named Leo Szilard. Leo Szilard had realized that all of the scientific experiments they had been doing in the 1930s about nuclear physics, atomic physics, you could actually build a bomb with it. They didn't know exactly how, but they realized that that was a possibility. So Szilard was known to other physicists, but he was not sort of world famous. He was a friend of Albert Einstein. So he went to Einstein, who was the legendary Albert Einstein, and gets him to sign this letter to Roosevelt. And the argument they make is, we have friends in universities around the world. We hear things. We hear that German physicists are working on this. If we don't get it first, the Germans will. And what will the Nazis do with a bomb that is more powerful than you can imagine? FDR is not a scientist, and he doesn't fully understand the physics, but he believes and trusts these guys, so he authorizes this project. The whole thing gets moved out, as I said, to Los Alamos, New Mexico, which is they build actually a small town out there in the middle of the desert. It's a completely isolated spot, and they work on building these bombs. Side story, they won't ask on the regents. The first bombs were made from uranium. Uranium is a radioactive metal, but it has to be refined into a very highly radioactive form, or you can change it into plutonium. So they need a lot of uranium to build these bombs, and they don't have much. Before the war even breaks out, there was a Belgian mining engineer named Edward Songier. And Songier realizes that there is uranium ore in the Belgian Congo, in Africa, a colony of Belgium in Africa. Nobody's talking about weapons exactly, nobody's building bombs, but there was a lot of experimentation being done with radioactivity and atomic energy. And people knew it had a lot of potential for power. So he starts worrying that someday this uranium ore that they've got in the Belgian Congo could wind up in the wrong hands. This is 1930s, and Adolf Hitler's already starting to make noise and all that. So he secretly smuggles it out of Africa and hides it in barrels in a storage yard in New York City. In fact, Staten Island, right under the Bayonne Bridge on Richmond Terrace. When he starts to hear that there are American government guys sniffing around physicists and miners looking for uranium to see if there's any around, he steps forward and says, I have a whole load of it, and turns it over, gives it to the American government. By this time the war has started, and that's actually the uranium that was used to make the atomic bombs was stored here on Staten Island. Okay. By July 1945, the scientists have 3 bombs. They built 3 of them. 1 uranium and 2 plutonium. If we ever have time, I'll do the physics of how these work. They work 2 different ways, but anyway, they've used up all the uranium and plutonium they have just to make these bombs. They don't have much of it. And the uranium ore that I just talked about, that you needed to go through thousands of tons of it to come up with a handful of usable uranium. Anyway, by 1945, they've got 3 bombs. They blow up one of them in the desert in New Mexico to see if it works, because nobody knows if this will work. July 16, 1945, they set off the first bomb in what is known as the Trinity test. That was the code name of the detonation. Look at that. There we go. Okay, the Trinity test. Well, they send word to Harry Truman. Guess what? The bomb works. Truman is president at this time. FDR had died in 1945, just before the war ends. Truman is now president, and he's faced with a decision about what to do with these bombs. Germany has already been defeated. War is over in Europe. Japan is losing the war. It's been beaten back to those home islands, the main Japanese islands. The next step might be an invasion of Japan. If that happens, the Japanese are going to defend their home islands something awful. It could mean hundreds of thousands of U.S. casualties. It might also mean millions of Japanese casualties. There are mass attacks, mass suicides that could happen. The Soviets have jumped into the Pacific War at this time, having won Europe. We saw right at the end of the war in Europe, the Soviets started grabbing up land. They're now sniffing around to grab up land in Asia. If we don't end the war quick, we could have the Soviets taking over Japan. So the argument is that the atomic bomb, using it, is going to kill people, but it might actually save lives. On the other hand, there are counter-arguments to that. Many of the military leaders said after the war, I should say, and this includes guys like Admiral Nimitz, who was the overall commander of the Navy in the Pacific, General MacArthur, who was the commander of the Army in the Pacific, Admiral Halsey, who's about the most famous other admiral in the Pacific. They all said Japan could have been defeated quickly by then without a bomb, that it's a myth, they claimed, that the bomb was necessary to end the war. Some people said that the scientists simply wanted to try it out. They had the bombs, they were itchy to see them work and see what they would do. It is a sad fact that the targets that were chosen for the first 2 atomic bombs, they were cities in Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they were picked specifically because those cities had not been bombed before. Because when they went in afterward and looked at the destruction, they wanted to be able to see clearly what had been caused by the bomb without having to confuse it with what had been caused by other attacks. That's a pretty cold way to look at this, right? So there are arguments for and against having used the bomb. Truman always claimed that he sincerely believed this, that he had actually saved far more lives than had been killed by using the bomb. If he hadn't used it, a lot more people would have died. He always claimed that that was the only reason he made the decision he did. It's still a debatable point. On August 6, 1941, we dropped the first of them. The Little Boy was the code name of it, was the uranium bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The deaths are hard to count. It's difficult and controversial. I won't even go into that. But basically, as many as 126,000 people wiped out by that bomb. August 9th, 1941, 3 days later, we dropped the plutonium bomb, the Fat Man, on Nagasaki. About 80,000 deaths there. It's not that Nagasaki was a smaller city, it's that it's the way the hills around it kind of work, it sort of shielded part of the area. A guess is that there were as many as 226,000 deaths. We could spend all day looking at photographs of the aftermath of that bombing. I urge you to look at any of the multitude of documentaries. The U.S. Army took huge numbers of raw film footage of it because right after the war they went in and they filmed the whole place. There were all sorts of scientific documentaries done and photographs. You can go look those up. So the 6th, the first one, the 9th, the second one. The Japanese government tries to figure out what to do, tries to come to grips with what this is. Truman gets on the radio and makes a newsreel movie, giving a short speech in which he announces that the U.S. has just used a new weapon that harnesses the power of the sun itself, which is true. The sun is a kind of gigantic atomic bomb, but constantly going off in a way. The Japanese are still trying to figure out what hit them. They do not at first realize this is an atomic weapon. On August 14th, the Japanese emperor announces that they've had it and Japan is surrendering and they give in. I point out to you, if I can see this, and what's this a picture of? Wrong. This is not Nagasaki or Hiroshima. This is Tokyo after a non-atomic bombing. One of the things to keep in mind, we focus a lot on the atomic bomb because it is a new gadget, it's a new technology, all that goes with that, and that's all true. But during World War II, we did one whole hell of a lot of damage without atomic weapons, with conventional weapons. This is the city of Japan, and you see all of this? Those are all neighborhoods that were burned down to rubble. These are some concrete buildings that survived, but much of Tokyo was traditional Japanese wooden architecture. That was the style. And all of this, as far as the eye can see, was burned to the ground by conventional U.S. regular incendiary bombs. Similarly in Dresden in Germany. So there was a lot of destruction done with conventional bombing as well. One of the problems with Hiroshima and Nagasaki is to point out the problem with the targets. In warfare, normally you target military facilities. War is never good or happy, but it's considered fair, for want of a good word, if your army goes after their army. You don't target civilians. You don't destroy schools, hospitals, people's homes if you can avoid it. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were cities. Yes, there were some factories in them that did produce some war material, but when you dropped an atomic bomb on them, or when you firebombed Tokyo, as this picture is, you're not just going to get the gun factory, the ammunition depot. You're going to get a lot of civilians. And so this is a very new kind of war. Even in World War I, we did not have the capabilities of mass destruction that you see in World War II. Okay. I'll get back to that poster in just a minute. Okay. The United States entry into World War II had significant impact on U.S. society. Affects war production and unemployment rates. You bet. Very briefly, the draft took up all able-bodied men. They started with the younger guys, 18, 19, 20s, able-bodied, good shape, and scooped them up. They would refuse to allow to enlist workers who had needed wartime skills. So if you were a trained machinist who knew how to work the machines that made the parts for airplanes, and you tried to enlist in the military, they would turn you down because you were doing more for the effort if you stayed in the factory than carrying a gun. But anybody who was not of a particular skill like that was potentially scooped up. Exempt from the draft, of course, would be older guys and guys with medical issues. Now, it makes sense, right? But as the war went on, they became less and less picky. Men as old as in their 30s, things like flat feet. If you have flat feet, that is, the arch in your foot is kind of low, it can give you all kinds of foot problems, particularly if you do a lot of walking. So if you have soldiers who are marching, or soldiers who have to walk from one end of Europe to the other, if the guy's got flat feet, he may wind up crippled halfway across. That's no help to anybody. So they would turn down guys with flat feet. They would turn down guys who were in their late 20s. By the time you get to 1943, 44, again, it doesn't matter to you, but just as an example, my grandfather, one of my grandfathers, they both served in the military in the war. One of them was 32 years old, and had flat feet and a couple of other health issues. But he got scooped up into the military anyway by that point because they were running out of guys. Unemployment drops below zero. What does it mean below zero? If unemployment is 10%, that means 10% of potential workers don't have jobs. If unemployment is zero, that means every worker has a job. If unemployment is negative 10, that means they have 10% more jobs than they have workers for. Woof. And so they start scooping everybody they can. One of the things, of course, most famously is women. So, nope, bam. Rosie the Riveter, she was called. She was a kind of character that shows up, a meme, if you like, in wartime posters, illustrations, even movies and things of the time. The idea of the woman who's left the home and gone in for an industrial job. So not just women who were being, secretaries and stuff. You did have that. You did have women take over the roles of men as secretaries and clerks and all that kind of thing. But now they're getting industrial jobs. It's a rivet gun there for heavy construction. That wasn't normally a woman's job. But here comes Rosie the Riveter, to go join. I point something out to you that's just very interesting. First of all, it's meant to show, hey, ladies, you can help the guys. You can be part of the war effort, and we can do it. Yeah? And Rosie's got her, coveralls on and like that. But notice something else, too. She's got lipstick. She's got her eyebrows done. One of the messages they had to give women is, you don't become a guy when you take a factory job. Don't fear you're going to lose your femininity, or the guys are not going to, want to date you anymore, or you're going to become, too masculine. You can stay a real woman's woman and also be a tough worker, helping out, the men as they go off to war. So the Rosie the Riveter thing was quite real. I also point out women in the military, I should put in here. Wax, waves, WAFs. So these are Women's Army Corps, women auxiliary volunteer enlistees, I think that was the Navy, Women's Army Air Forces. So this was the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. And it was women's units, mostly to replace men in non-combat jobs. So they said, we don't need a guy who could be carrying a rifle, filling out forms and doing the paperwork and that kind of thing, cutting paychecks. So they recruited women into these special women's units to replace the guys. They worked in the military too. I should point out, rationing was a big part of the period. So I'll show you this. This is a nice website here. This is the American History Museum, which has a lot of good stuff on it. But I'll just pull this up for you here because this is worth looking at. Whoops. Bang, bang. And I get this in here? Yeah, that's good. So rationing was a thing. The consumer products, consumer good production drops. Metal, which could be going to make, private cars or that kind of stuff, is all being scooped up for the military. Rubber is being used for that. I'll show you that in a second. And even food. There was plenty of food. The United States never really starved. Britain starved. If you look at Britain, the average British person during the war did not go without meals. This is an actually scientific fact that they did the statistics. They didn't go without meals, but they lost weight significantly over the course of the war because they were so restricted on what food they could buy, because everything had to be imported to Britain. In the United States, we always had enough food. It was a matter of getting the right food to the right places. You needed food for the troops that could be prepared in the field and turned into rations and all that. So you couldn't always get everything you wanted. The way they did this, therefore, was rationing. You got, every person, man, woman, and child, got ration books. And your ration books depended in part on your age, because kids need different things than from adults. And sometimes I'll point out your job. So this is the kind of stuff that they had. Ration books. I'll show you what all these different bits are. These are ration tokens. They're points, blue points and red points, and you would have a stack of these. And here's why. I'll show you this. Well, no, I know it's coming. Hang on. I've looked at these before. Where is it? Nope. Hang on. There we go. So when you went into the supermarket, all the food had points associated with it. So a can of peas, a pound can of peas, was 16 points. A can of sliced pineapple was 24 points. Spinach was 11 points. Now, what did that mean? When you went and bought it, you paid a price. You had to pay, the spinach was, 50 cents a can, make up a number, right? You paid for the guy, but you also had to pay a certain number of points out of your point ration. And there were vegetable points, meat points, fat points, fats as in butter and lard and oil and like that were all separate. There were separate points for sugar. Something like pineapple was a lot of points because it had to be imported. Sugar was a lot of points because it had to be imported. Something like spinach is easy to grow. They grow plenty of it. It's not that popular anyway, so there's always leftover. And so pretty easy to get. Soup is mostly water, so that's only 6 points there. And you got, hang on, nope. You got these books. You got a ration book every so often that had stamps in it. And these little stamps in here were ration points, and there were different colors depending on what it is it was for. If it was for meat, if it was for vegetables, whatever. And so when you went in and you needed to use 5 points, you'd have to tick off 5 of these stamps and give it to the grocery guy. When you used up your stamps, you were flat out of luck. That was it. You were done. And you couldn't buy any more of that. And you had to sign for it. They were not transferable, so you couldn't lend them out. Ration farm equipment, we don't need to go into that. And let me just show you. So these are different ration stamps for different things at different times. They kept changing the system all through the war. I'll come back to this in a minute. The coins were like change. So if you gave a stamp that was 5 points and you bought something that was only 4 points, they would give you one of these tokens back in red or blue that you could, so you didn't lose your points, and you kept them like coins, like poker chips. There was also one of the things that was very expensive was cloth. So they gave you all of these like helpful hints how to save money on clothes, on cloth. Here you have a hem, right, on the dress, which is, you need it, but it's kind of wasted cloth, and you can make the hem half as big. This kind of stuff. And there were all these they wanted you to turn your thermostat down to save oil. These are the gasoline rations. These were among the most famous. So you got a sticker for your car, A, B, depending on your job. So if you had a job that was essential to the military, they figured out how many miles you needed to drive, and you got a sticker that went with it. So police cars had like highest level of sticker because they're always driving around, and of course you need them. But if you were a guy who had a non-essential job and you worked down the street, you got a much lower level sticker. That determined how much gasoline you could buy. So you also had little ration books for that, and you could only buy so much at a time. So when you pulled into the gas station, the guy would look at the sticker and figure out how much gas he could sell you. The interesting thing was, it wasn't about the gasoline. It was about the tires. The gasoline we actually had enough of. It was the rubber in the tires that we couldn't get enough of because all of that had to be transported across the Pacific. And we needed it for the military, and we couldn't spare the boats that might be torpedoed bringing rubber back to the U.S. And the Philippines, which was a main source of rubber, was occupied by the Japanese. So to save people wearing out their tires, they created this gasoline ration system, and people thought they were saving gasoline, but what they were really saving were their tires. And they encouraged you to not use your car as much as possible. Share your car, check your air pressure, cross-switch your tires regularly. That was to keep the wear on them even, to prevent them blowing out, and so you could sort of stretch the use of the tire more. These are all ration books here. I'm just going to show you a couple of these so you get the hang of how much it affected average life. And this affected everybody. Oh, sugar purchase certificate. Buying sugar was particularly difficult because it all had to be brought in from sugar cane, and there was a very strict rationing on this. So kids actually kind of had the biggest problem with it. You could get sugar, if you notice it, the sugar purchase certificate. The purpose of it is for canning. So they encouraged people to can their own vegetables, grow vegetables in their own garden, and then can them. Well, usually with canning vegetables, you use sugar or salt to preserve them. And so, well, if you were going to use it for that, we would make an exception and give you extra sugar. But kids couldn't get their hands on candy. It was hard to get chocolate and that sort of stuff. Okay. They also, I'll just mention too, war bonds. Remember, we talked about war bonds for World War I. This was the same thing. So these are war stamps. So you could buy a stamp for 10 cents. That meant like kids even could save up their pennies. They could buy a war stamp. Once you filled up the book here, you could take the book and turn it in to get a war bond when you got enough of them together. And that was called the Liberty Loans, selling the war bonds to help fund the effort. Victory Book, this is another one. And this was very big with average workers, but also for kids, because they could, it was an affordable way for them. Okay. Let's talk about now the Korematsu case. Absolutely, positively, 100% one you need to know. They love to ask about it. It's one of the key Supreme Court cases. So let me bold that there. Korematsu case is the Japanese internment case. If you think Marbury-Madison, you should think judicial review. You think Korematsu, think Japanese internment. When the war begins, thousands of U.S.-born, U.S. citizens of Japanese ancestry are forced to move from the West Coast to relocation camps in the middle of the United States. The fear was if Japan tried to invade the United States, could we trust their loyalty? Whose side would they be on? Now, none of these people were charged with a crime. None of them were suspected spies. But because they had a Japanese last name, they were born in the U.S., most of them. They were interned. The camps were not technically prisons. They were internment camps. So FDR, as Commander-in-Chief of the military, declared a coastal defense zone and then declared that he was relocating the Japanese. In theory, their businesses and land were supposed to be protected, waiting for them to return. They would go off to the camps. They had some opportunities to work there, but they largely sat out the war. So this, and let me just show you. So I want to be clear. This is a picture of one of these camps. You can see it's out in the Great Plains. There are the Rocky Mountains in the distance. And these are sort of the barracks that the folks lived in. Here they are. This again at the foot of the Rockies Mountains. You can see, let me just move it in the back there. And you can see the cabins. These folks are lining up, I think, for supplies or something. There's one of the dining barracks. And there, pull this in just a bit, is one of the dormitories. A bunch of guys there playing checkers or something. I want to be clear. These people were not tortured. These are not concentration camps like the Germans. They were not executed. They were not, threatened on a daily basis. They were not beaten up. On the other hand, they were forcibly held against their choice in these camps until the end of the war, for nothing. There was no accusation they had done anything wrong. It was just in case. Okay, well, this fellow Korematsu sues the United States government and says that this amounts to a kind of unconstitutional arrest. The Supreme Court said, in times of war, the president's powers expand, individual civil liberties shrink, and if an act is necessary for national defense, FDR is within his rights to do this. So the Supreme Court finds in favor of FDR and against the Japanese. Important thing to know about Korematsu. Japanese internment. The court found in favor of the government doing this. And always we see this theme with Lincoln suspending habeas corpus, the Schenck case in World War I, and Korematsu in World War II. In times of warfare, civil liberties have a tendency to shrink. The Korematsu case we look back on as terrible. Supreme Court justices today, conservative and liberal, all sides of the court, have said it was a wrong decision, and if the case ever came up again, we should decide it differently. But that's what it was at the time. Aftermath, I point out. First, a group of Japanese men from the camps joined the army. They actually insisted on joining the army. They fought the army to let them join. They wanted to serve the country under the flag. They're Japanese American citizens. The army finally gave in and let them join the military as a group, but would not let them fight in the Pacific Theater. They didn't trust them. They did let them fight in Europe. Ironically, the Japanese battalion that served, there were actually two Japanese battalions that served, became the most decorated units of the war. There were more medals of honor, silver stars, bronze stars per person in those units than any other, which kind of gives the lie to this whole thing that we couldn't trust them. Also, aftermath, sadly, when they return home after the war, most found their houses sold, their farms gone, their businesses destroyed or taken over by others. It's a terribly unfair thing. Let's speak briefly about contributions of women, African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Mexican Americans to the war effort. Okay, we'll just do a few things quickly. You'll have to look up some of these if you want more detail. First of all, the U.S. military stayed segregated. You had colored troops and white troops. In 1947, after the war, Truman signs an order as commander-in-chief ending segregation in the military. He notes that black soldiers had fought as heroically as the white soldiers had, but it only happens after the war. In the Navy, black soldiers were mostly restricted to working as cooks and in housekeeping department, what was called steward's mates. In the Army, you did have things like the Tuskegee Airmen. Remember the Tuskegee Institute? Booker T. Washington, helping African Americans in the late 1800s and early 20th century train for jobs. Well, during the war, that becomes home to a fighter pilot training school. And the entire unit, because it's segregated units, is black. Pilots are all officers. So these are black men who are officers in the military, who've heard of that, as fighter pilots. They actually flew in combat, many of them, not all of the units did, and quite heroically and heavily decorated. Eleanor Roosevelt herself, the wife of the president, slightly in defiance of her husband, FDR always tried to stay away from civil rights issues because he was afraid, he was already pushing the country so far with the New Deal, he was afraid that it would cause too much backfire to him. She visited and flew in their plane with them and then did like a big photo op because she really believed in racial integration. Okay, let's also talk about, I guess briefly, Native Americans. The Navajo Code Talkers. Many of you have seen that movie, I think. It is a true story. The movie is a little bit Hollywood, as all movies, are. But the basic idea is correct. The military needed an easy, quick way for units to communicate. It was particularly the Marine Corps, to communicate by voice radio, unit to unit. And you didn't have time to sit there with a piece of paper and encode messages. So they came up with this idea. The Navajo language was not really written down. It wasn't known outside of the Navajo community. So they got these Native Americans, Navajo kids, who became radio operators and simply talked to each other in their own language. And they made up certain codes themselves, among themselves with it. But it is a pretty interesting story. If you're interested, I doubt the Regents will get too detailed on it, but you can look up the movie. It's a good movie. You guys would probably like it. The Asian Americans, I talked about the Japanese, Mexican workers, migrant workers, I should mention, kept the farms going throughout the war with a guest worker kind of program. So the United States actually encouraged Mexican immigration into the United States to keep the farms going. These guys worked, particularly in the Southwest, harvesting all that food you needed. Mexican Americans served in the military, of course, and again, rather heroically. So all of these people made their contribution. We talked about a few of them. Okay, next little item here. We talk about, let's do this. In response to World War II and the Holocaust, the U.S. played a major role in efforts to prevent human suffering in the future. All right. So, just briefly, Nazi persecution of Jews began in the early 1930s. Persecution, abuse, but not yet mass factory-like murder. The rest of the world sometimes protested the abuse of the Jewish people, but many felt that it was either the Jews' own problem to solve, let them go complain about it to the German government, or, I should say, were anti-Semitic themselves. There were a lot of people who were not in Nazi Germany and not in Germany at all, and may not have identified as Nazis, there was a lot of anti-Jewish prejudice even in the United States. Just for instance, in early 1939, before the war starts, Hitler let a ship, the St. Louis, leave Germany. He lets them go. 900 Jewish passengers, actually a little more than that, 930, I think. And he challenged the world. You complaining about how we treat the Jews? You take them. The St. Louis tries to land in Cuba. Cuba turns them away. Cuba says, boy, I really can't type, huh? No. Only admits U.S. citizens. Cuba would only let a U.S. citizen in. Take that. The St. Louis tried to dock in the U.S. They attempted to come into port in Florida. The U.S. turned them away. FDR was afraid of triggering anti-Semitic anger if he let them in. Canada turned them down. And so, after tooling around the world, the captain was forced to bring them back to Europe. Some wound up in Belgium or France, not Germany, but they didn't know that they were about to be invaded. So about a quarter of the people on the boat eventually were killed in the concentration camps, we think. Some of them did survive the war. So before the war, it's not as though everybody was reaching out to do a solid for the Jewish people in Germany. Okay, we know the U.S. enters the war December 7th, 1941. January of 1942, there is a meeting called the Wannsee Conference. They won't ask that on the Regents. But it's a famous conference. It's a group of Nazi bureaucrats who work out the plans for the so-called final solution, that is, the systematic liquidation of the Jews in the concentration camps. Ironically, that was scheduled for December 9th, 1941, but because the U.S. had just declared war on Germany, they canceled it while they figured out what was going to go on with that. The Allies, we know, found out about the plans. We know that because in a December 13th, 1942, so it's about almost a year later, Edward R. Murrow, who's the most famous radio newsman of the time, broadcast a program in which he talked about a horror beyond what imagination can grasp. There are no longer concentration camps. We must speak now only of extermination camps. So clearly, he knew what was going on. A couple of days later, the United States joined 10 other Allied governments in condemning, we're already at war, but we condemn Nazi Germany's bestial policy of cold-blooded extermination of the Jews. Therefore, at least by 1942, the U.S. had some idea what was happening at Dachau, Auschwitz, and the rest of them. By then, though, what do you do about it? Some people said, and this is around FDR, should we bomb the railroad lines that go into the camps? Should we bomb the camps themselves? If you bomb the camp, it would stop it being used for killing new people being brought in, but it would kill the people already there. Do we really want to be bombing these poor innocent victims in the camps? FDR fears that making the camps a main strategic goal, like for the army, might mean that the war would be seen as a Jewish war, and that people would start to not back it. So he decides the best bet is to aggressively try to win the whole war as quickly as possible. If we can defeat Germany, we can make this go away. I mentioned to you in April 1945, U.S. soldiers enter Ohrdruf. It's late. Ohrdruf, which was a part of the Buchenwald concentration camps, and they were completely unprepared for what it was they were going to find. Now, once again, this is a quick review. We don't have time to do this in detail. I am presuming I'm just reminding you. This is a worthwhile place. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. If you go and find their website, you can just Google it up. They have great resources about this. But I just happened to show you this one thing. They have a page on the liberation of Ohrdruf camp. And these are, this is a Joe average soldier, a guy named Henry Malenfant, who was in the 4th Armored Division. They didn't know what they were coming for. They were just moving across Germany trying to, defeat the Nazis. They come across this camp. Nobody had really briefed them or prepared them for this. And they find, this is the snapshots he took. This is the burial pit. And he's estimating there were 300,000 people that were buried in these pits. This is one of the places where they were burning the bodies. And the soldiers who came in, found this as they walked into the camp. So it freaked everybody out because of the soldiers in the field. Even though FDR may have known some of what was going on, the soldiers in the field really, this was news to them. After the war, of course, the Nazis are put on trial at Nuremberg. You should know the Nuremberg war crimes trials from your previous study in Global. But they put the leaders that they have. Adolf Hitler, of course, has committed suicide by this time, but they take the generals and the leaders of the government they do have, and they put them on trial. I point out, just real quick here, they are charged with crimes against peace. 4 crimes. Crimes against peace. That is, starting the war in violation of all of the treaties and agreements they were party to. War crimes. That is, violations of the laws of war. A common plan or conspiracy to commit the criminal acts that they're charged with. Okay, so you're charged with making war on other countries, with violating the laws of war. By this we mean doing things like shooting unarmed prisoners, etc. They were also charged with crimes against humanity. Now, who made these laws? How can you charge a man for violating a law that had not been made? There's no international world congress making these laws. And people said that. People asked that. Well, war crimes were defined. Everybody had signed treaties against intentionally killing civilians, shooting unarmed prisoners, torturing prisoners once you had them. So you had rules about how you treated POWs. You couldn't torpedo civilian ships, all that kind of stuff. War crimes were actually pretty defined. Crimes against, quote, peace, they're a little bit fuzzy in that Germany had signed treaties, but it was a new idea to enforce them with criminal penalties for violating some of them. But crimes against humanity, who ever heard of that? Robert O. Jackson is sent over by President Truman as the U.S. prosecutor for the trial. He was a Supreme Court justice, and he takes a leave from the court to do this. He was also, everybody knew he was kind of up for the job of Chief Justice, but if he took this job as prosecutor, he was going to be out of Washington so long, he was kind of giving up his one shot to be Chief Justice. But he did it. He took this on rather than be Chief Justice of the United States because he believed in the justice of the cause. And he famously gives in his speech this thing: the wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, so devastating, that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. That 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. It's a very famous quote. What is he saying? He's saying we have to hold these people to justice. Their attack on humanity was so heinous that if it ever happens again, humanity may not survive. And he's saying, we're not taking vengeance on them. We're giving them a trial. We have judges in the room. They have defense counsel. They're able to put on an argument in their own defense. We're following the rules here, which shows how civilized we are, rather than just in anger whacking these guys. We're giving them the rule of law and a chance at due process. Jackson's argument is that there are certain acts that so violate the very notion of human dignity, that strike at the heart of humanity itself, they are so obviously evil, the human race can come to a consensus that they deserve treatment as crimes. You need not have a formal law to know that genocide is evil and a crime against the whole human race. He says the real complaining party at the bar, that is, the person who is complaining to the court, is civilization itself. Of course, they are convicted and serve long sentences or are executed, and humanity makes a statement to itself about morality. Last thing I'll mention, just real quick, Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was the wife of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR, of course, did the New Deal. The New Deal includes nothing about civil rights, rights for blacks, any of that. FDR was so afraid that he was pushing the limits so far with the New Deal that if he added civil rights to it, people would just turn on him altogether. Americans were not ready to acknowledge blacks as fully equal across the board. Eleanor was just the opposite. The wife spent the whole New Deal trying to push Franklin into recognizing human rights, civil rights, social justice, social equality, and so on. When the war ends, we create the United Nations to try to prevent war ever happening again. It started off as the Allies, but as the war ends, the United Nations transforms into a universal organization of all countries, and it had been part of the legacy of FDR. In 1949, the new UN asks his widow, Eleanor, to chair a committee drawing up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And they produce this universally accepted document that is considered the basis for moral interaction between peoples and countries, I should say, to this day. It is still out there. It is still something we hold countries accountable to. Okay, it's a long one, but I'll leave it there.